Christ. You sure he's dead?
No doubt.
What about the comms tower blacklist set up next to the hotel?
You want to use their gear to call global risk.
Only way to contact our ride.
We should secure the landing site.
You take care of the LZ and avoid enemy contact if you can. Stay safe.
Okay.
Hi, doggy.
Crossfirex is one of the worst things ever made by another human being. It's an utterly forgettable experience that most people didn't even bother to review, which is made even more painful given the pedigree of its campaign developer, Remedy Entertainment. Yeah, the same guys who bestowed upon us the Max Payne series, along with, to a lesser extent, Alan Wake, Control, and then Quantum Break. They've now been reduced to, well, this.
Trip mines, great. Gonna have to shoot him.
Subtle.
Now, I'll be honest, before this game came out, I'd never even heard of the Crossfire series before, which kind of makes sense considering it's never really been all that popular outside of countries like China and South Korea, where it has a player base of upwards of 1 billion. Not exactly a massive flex when it's popular in a country that already has one of the world's highest populations to begin with, but yeah, still pretty impressive. From what I can tell after having looked into footage of it, it really just kind of looks like a knockoff version of Counter-Strike. And much like Counter-Strike, it's a game which has found most of its player base on the PC. Headshot! So yeah, what a fantastic idea it was to make CrossfireX an Xbox exclusive. Yeah, good one.
It's not responding well, sir.
Now with this recent release, this makes CrossfireX the third game in the franchise, but sadly the adage of third time's the charm doesn't really apply here. In fact, I'd more liken this to a spiritual successor to Hunt Down the Freeman.
Stop! Stop!
I'm not even going to attempt to open up that rotting can of worms to cover the multiplayer. With barely any maps to play through, unlockable guns hidden behind paywalls, and the myriad of other problems with things like the latency and hit detection, I could honestly spend an entire video breaking that whole thing down, but that's not what we're here for.
Oh my god!
There's only so much pain and suffering I can put up with, and I pretty much hit my quota as it is just tackling this campaign.
Items.
The reason I say that is because, to put it simply, the campaign here is just bad. And not even really in a so bad that it's good kind of way either. Playing through CrossfireX's campaign is one of the few times where I've been working on a video and it actually felt like work. You know what I mean? Like, most of the time when I'm working on a review, I have a bit of a semblance of enjoyment, along with that realization that I still need to somewhat concentrate, because I'm keeping in mind that at some point I'm going to be talking about what I'm experiencing. Crossfire, on the other hand, just felt like I was playing through it just to get through it, and seeing the end credits roll when the whole thing finished was actually cathartic and had me breathe out a big sigh of relief, knowing the whole thing had finally come to an end and I'd never have to subject myself to it ever again.
Piece of shit.
Loading up the game for the first time, it makes you scroll through the entire terms and conditions before proceeding, all of which, yeah, I totally read. Then you'll find the campaign tucked away in the main menu, at which point I discovered I still needed to pay money to actually play it. Yeah, turns out my Game Pass subscriptions are only enough to get me into the multiplayer mode. So, you know, I bought it. This required a $15 purchase and a 21GB download before it was finally installed. And this is only for the first part of the campaign. Yeah, there's a whole second chapter to get as well. Yeah, check this out too. We hope you love it. I mean, at this point, they're just rubbing the whole thing in my face. Anyway, once everything is all finally installed and ready to go, you're starting off with the first chapter, Catalyst, where you're thrown right into the action with barely any kind of introduction or explanation as to what's even happening. I don't know, maybe it makes more sense if you played the other games or something, but the gist is that you're playing as a guy named Hall who's working for the group called Global Risk, heading into the fictional country of Azkazian, chasing after a mercenary group called Blacklist who are up to no good and have started causing trouble in the neighborhood. And it really felt like I'd missed out on some kind of crucial context establishing what was actually going on. Luckily, Hall's not going in alone, and along with his buddies Randall, Morales, and Kavanaugh, they then partake in what has to be one of the least subtle combat drops of all time, as they light up the side of a building with a spotlight and a goddamn chain gun. I mean, I think if they jumped out of the sky with parachutes that shot out fireworks, and all had giant neon signs around their necks, well, that honestly would have drawn less attention. This whole prologue sequence doesn't really have any other purpose than to just establish Hall's bromance with Kavanaugh, who gets shot and apparently killed. Kavanaugh! While Hall just really kind of stands there like a dingus, unsure of what to do, before catching the butt of a rifle with the back of his head. After he wakes up, it then becomes the goal to make contact with headquarters to organize an escape chopper, along with also trying to figure out what happened to Kavanagh and who's responsible.
Okay.
As for the gameplay from this point, well, do you remember that one mission in Modern Warfare, where Soap and Captain Price are like having to sneak to all these farms and small villages, getting into those occasional skirmishes with these militia soldiers? Yeah, well, imagine that stretched out to an entire campaign. That's Operation Catalyst. Kill a bunch of people, blow some shit up, and roll the credits. And yeah, what a perfect comparison to make. It really does feel like it's a 2007 game in a 2022 looking engine. It's even been filled with the same kind of lame-ass tropes we saw in all those kinds of games, all compiled into one neat little package.
This is stupid, man.
Things like running from cover to cover to avoid sniper fire, check.
Wait for my go!
Covering someone from a couple of 100 meters away with a sniper rifle, check.
There you go.
Running down a hallway to avoid a series of explosions, check. Running down the carriage of a collapsing train before it falls off a cliff, check. And who could forget the old dodging tank shells as you run from cover to cover? Tank shells which seem to shake the very foundation of the entire fucking planet. It's not all bad though. Like, I like the sawn-off shotgun the few times you get to use it. It actually works really well with the slow motion mechanic. Plus you're often in close to medium range with the enemies, so it's actually pretty effective. I think the submachine guns also have the right amount of power to them, especially the MP7, which is a gun that I will always simp for. But apart from that, it's really just a pretty standard military themed shooter. And if you played one in the last couple of decades, well, then you've already played this. Weapons have the same looking red dot sights and ACOG sights you've seen 100 times before. And it's that same old generic hit scanning gunplay that permeates every Call of Duty and Battlefield clone that ever existed. One way they did try to mix things up a bit is with the game's tacked on bullet time mode. Now I say it's tacked on because, to be honest, it really is superfluous and you never actually need to use it to progress. The other thing is that it's not even unique to the main character. I mean, the game is constantly swapping back and forth between these members of the squad, and all of these guys have the same ability, so it's really just there for show. I mean, look, let's compare it to Crossfire's predecessors, right? Namely Max Payne, which this game, like so many others, owes its existence to, and also one that happened to be developed by Remedy Entertainment. In Max Payne, when you slowed down time, you could literally see the bullets whizzing through the air, and then adjust your movements based off that. You could use it to leap around corners and gun enemies down before you'd even hit the ground. It was an enhancement of your base reflexes that gave you a much needed edge in combat, considering otherwise you'd get dropped like a bag of shit. Same thing with the bullet time in a game like Fear. Trying to take on the replicants without slow motion, you'd get your ass kicked in like 2 seconds. So it was a crucial mechanic needed to succeed, and it also allowed the player to survive encounters and sequences they'd probably otherwise lose in real time. In Crossfire though, it's really just an aesthetic addition. I mean, you do reload faster, which is a nice touch, but it's not like it really gives you this innate advantage over your enemies. It's just, you know, instead of shooting people in normal motion, you can now shoot them in slow motion. Now with this incredibly obnoxious filter across the screen, and combined with the most horrendous aiming acceleration I think I've ever experienced in my 30-something years alive in this timeline. I think the fact you can get through the entire game and never have to use this once really speaks volumes about just how pointless it is. Plus the fact that, like I said, every single character in the game can use it, well, just kind of loses its luster. It's like Oprah going around and handing out bullet time to everyone. You get bullet time, and you get bullet time. Honestly, the controls in this have to be some of the worst shooting controls I've ever experienced, especially when it comes to a shooter that you play with a controller. They've somehow made it so you both over and under aim, and it seems when it's not doing one of those things, it's doing the other. I mean, it's bad enough in the campaign, and don't ever get me started on the multiplayer.
Pass.
And what's probably worst of all is how every time you activate bullet time, the fucking sensitivity goes through the roof, and your aim just flies all over the place. To make it worse, there doesn't even seem to be a way to change this. And on some level, you've kinda gotta hand it to these guys. I mean, to make controls this bad for a console shooter in 2022, I mean, it's not like we've had a couple of decades of shooters beforehand to use for reference, is it?
Sorry, but that's a fact.
Another thing you pick up on pretty quickly is just how bad the writing and the dialogue is. Not even talking about how barely comprehensible the story is. I mean, just the writing on a basic level. It's so odd and bizarre. Like it's been written by someone who's trying to impersonate how humans speak. It's something you're going to notice in both chapters, but I think the first one is definitely the worst.
Hey, this could be a career moment for you, Holmes.
The voice acting often doesn't match the mood of the scene itself, and dialogue between different characters sounds like it's been recorded separately.
Oh man, this ain't good.
It's almost like each statement is the beginning of a new sentence.
The dream started out the same. Back home, everything felt awry. Somehow, this was not my dream. Impossibly, I was a visitor in someone else's dream. Kavanagh, he was trying to tell me something vital and urgent.
Now look, I understand that not every game can utilize expensive motion capture and have all the actors on some kind of soundstage in a controlled environment, but I mean dialogue like this really highlights that polarizing difference when the basic connection of having an actual person to bounce off is missing entirely. And look, if I'm wrong and this stuff was all recorded in real time with a bunch of actors at once, well, then that's even worse.
Where'd Steiner go?
In the mines, checking to see if your friend survived the catalyst.
The catalyst?
About the only character who I thought actually did a good job was Fontaine.
Thank you.
That weirdly capable femme fatale who works for Blacklist and looks exactly like Silver Sable from the Spider-Man game. And the reason for that is that she actually sounds like she's delivering her lines with some kind of conviction.
But what is war without sacrifice?
And I actually started to get excited because it looked like she was going to be a boss, but oh no, they just shoot her and then that's the last we see of her for that part.
Thank you.
And don't even get me started on some of the facial animations. Hall is the biggest offender here. I mean, the faces this guy pulls are just odd. Then there's a bunch of these hallucination sequences, which is where you see the Sam Lake influence coming in. And these could have been interesting, but you have no idea what's going on, and not in like a clever way, more in just a confusing, irritating, and unclear way. These sequences just seem to be more concerned with the visuals, instead of communicating the plot elements to the player. Then in the second chapter, they just seem to do away with them completely, so, I mean, what's the point? Doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't make any sense.
Any sense? What was I talking about before? Oh yeah, the combat. It's really basic. You just kind of run from one area to the next, shooting enemies over and over. And they don't really show any kind of strategy outside of just hiding behind cover and shooting at you. Later on, there's soldiers who are more heavily armored, but they're pretty much just the same as the standard enemies, just with a bit more health points. All up, Operation Catalyst will take the better part of 90 minutes to get through, and those are 90 minutes of your life you're never getting back. And you know what's probably the saddest part about all of this is that we're not even done yet. Yeah, that's right, bitch. There's still the second chapter to play through as well, called Operation Spectre. But at this point, going off how bad that first part was, for me to shell out more dough just to play it, well, I'd have to be some kind of fucking dumbass, wouldn't I?
Oh, fuck. I can't believe you've done this.
Alright, well this one introduces an entirely new cast of characters, just in case those guys from the first part weren't forgettable enough to begin with. Though in a bit of a neat twist, you're now playing as the opposition, Black Fist. And it actually starts off with a pretty cool sequence where you're hijacking a train that's moving at these breakneck speeds. And I really like the way that it effortlessly transitions into gameplay. During the prologue, you're playing as a guy named Logan who sounds so much like Elias Tefexis that when I found out it wasn't Elias, I actually got depressed. I mean, something like his inclusion might have almost redeemed this second campaign.
Funny, I knew your mother a long time ago.
Doesn't really matter though, because eventually you'll be hopping into the shoes of another guy named Torres as he's being taken to prison for selling counterfeit Pokemon cards or something.
Are you gonna talk the whole time?
Only to be saved by Blacklist operatives in the nick of time before Global Risk soldiers can arrive and execute him. Yeah, Global Risk this time are basically portrayed as the bad guys, with one of their higher ranking officers, a dude named Maddox, being this sociopathic antagonist who really needs to chill the hell out. Honestly, this guy takes way too much pleasure in being the bad guy that the very notion of him being morally grey just doesn't exist. I bet all this guy's missing is a secret lair to hang out in and a moustache to twirl. Now, I was going to worry about putting spoilers in this part of the video, but then I just thought, who cares? I mean, it's not like I'm really convincing people to go out and play this thing, and the ending is about the dumbest thing ever anyway. Basically, it's that old self-fulfilling prophecy trope, where Torres is supposed to eventually turn into some kind of soldier called the Ghost, who is then going to somehow destroy the world. That's not paraphrasing either, that's literally what they think he's going to do.
Soon, the entire world will burn.
So, in trying to prevent this, some of these key characters end up just making this happen anyway. And it's kind of stupid because he doesn't turn into the Ghost for any other reason than just coming across what's basically the nanosuit from Crisis.
Maximum armor, maximum strength, cloak engaged.
This thing gives him the ability to cloak, along with being able to run really fast and also stab things real good. And somehow that also means he's gonna destroy the world. Okay, that's pretty damn stupid if you ask me. But if nothing else, it does give you some pretty fun sequences at the end of the chapter when you finally get to wear that ghost suit. Still though, most of the cool stuff is shown in cinematics, like Torres kicking someone's ass, or this bit here where these guys are using wingsuits and jumping out of a plane. And you'd think you'd get to do some of that stuff during gameplay, well, guess again. There's not even any kind of final encounter with Maddox, and every fight is just a cinematic you have no control over. The closest thing you get to a boss fight is a giant turret that's got these 3 weak spots, but this is over in about 15 seconds, so I don't even think it counts. Though there was a really funny moment when a random enemy just walked through a glass window like it was made out of candy floss. If nothing else though, I do think visually this second episode looks a lot better than the first one. The episode starts off on a train, and you know how much I love my train levels, followed by a shootout in some city streets and then more shootouts inside an office building. When you first start playing as Torres, they give you this badass automatic pistol, and that thing just shreds through enemies and is completely awesome. But it always feels like they never know when they've got a good thing going here, because it never escalates getting past just being cool on face value. I mean, during that opening level with Torres as an example, you ever hear something about a hurricane warning as you're moving through this town. So you might expect there to be some kind of storm to deal with, which would have made things really interesting. I mean, have you ever seen footage of a hurricane? That shit is intense. So imagine a gunfight in the middle of that, inside a crumbling, shaking building that's getting torn to pieces. But instead of that, you know, nothing happens and the potential is squandered.
Hurricane procedures are in effect.
I mean, there's a car chase at the end of this level, and you wouldn't even know there was a hurricane at all. Just looks like it's a bit windy and overcast.
It's actually going pretty well.
Oh man, this ain't good.
There's a bit later on where you lose all your weapons and only have a knife, and you might think you'd have to stealth for a bit and remain unseen. And finally, the gameplay might get mixed up a bit. Only, never mind, you just find a gun a couple of minutes later and can go right back to shooting people. In fact, I don't even think there's a takedown move until you get that ghost suit. Plus, this episode features all of that lazy, half-baked writing that requires a serious amount of suspension of disbelief. Like stuff like this, for instance, right, where Torres zip lines down this thing with his bare hands. I mean, please tell me how this isn't ripping all the skin off his goddamn fingers. I think about the only thing I liked here was the last shootout, where they give you free pickings as to what guns you can take, because one of them is a grenade launcher, and it just makes this whole area work really well. The combat is split up across 2 levels, giving you different options, and you can easily break line of sight here and crash behind cover that actually covers you. Plus, the physics for the grenade launcher are just entertaining as hell, and if the whole game had been like this, well, it might have been a better experience. On the plus side, kind of, CrossfireX is a pretty damn good looking game. It runs on the Unreal Engine 4 and makes good use of realistic lighting, highly detailed environments and weapon models, to the point that it almost starts to look true to life. But even then, that almost kind of ends up being a detriment anyway, because it really starts to lack any kind of style. Plus, the stuff like the volumetric lighting, the smoke and fog effects often makes spotting enemies kind of tricky. So, I mean, yeah, it all looks good and hyper-realistic, but it's also come at the expense of it really having its own personality.
Come on, bro.
I mean, if you took away the heads-up display and told someone to tell you what game this is, despite the fact that no one knows this thing exists to begin with, they'd still have no idea what they're playing. I mean, I played this, and I probably still couldn't identify it.
Come on, bro.
I think that's really the biggest fault a game can have, is to not have any soul, and that's what this whole thing boils down to. It really is just this weird, soulless disaster, and it kind of begs the question as to who this game is aimed at. I mean, who is their intended demographic here? You've got that multiplayer mode, which is just some of the most boring, run-of-the-mill shit of all time. Then, on the other hand, you've got this incredibly forgettable single-player campaign, which fails to deliver on the story or the gameplay front. Maybe if they allowed for crossplay with other platforms, it might have had a bit more of a following, but they've just completely ostracized those two other huge demographics, the PS5 and the PC. The latter, I'd argue, being the most important and the biggest player base. So overall, I just don't get this game at all.
That's bullshit.
It's like it's been made by people who have no idea about how anything works, and I'm not just talking about gaming, I mean things in general. I assume at some point they're going to be adding new episodes to the campaign mode.
Why?
And I know they're already adding in new content for the multiplayer, but I think that's just going to be too little too late. I think gamers are becoming smarter these days and can start to recognize when something just isn't worth their time or money anymore. I just kind of wish I had done the same before reviewing this. But if I've convinced at least one person not to play Crossfirex, well, then I'll consider my job done.
What's your status?
More of the same.
But you know what? On the bright side, it's only about a week or so now until Shadow Warrior 3 comes out.